Hello, everybody. You should all be muted and no cameras on at the moment, but welcome to the seminar. We'll just wait and see, give it a couple of minutes for people to come through because we're expecting quite a few people to attend the seminar this morning. Just give it another minute and then we can start, and anybody else that joins can join in. Okay then, so you'll see that the meeting is also being recorded. We usually load the meeting onto the Alliance for Finance website a couple of days after the seminar, so that will also be available for you to either refer back to or to let any of your colleagues know that they can go in and watch that if they've not been able to attend the session today. So hello and welcome to the Alliance for Finance Pensions seminar event. I'm Anya Lomax, the chair of the Alliance for Finance. Thank you all for attending. We have a great turnout today and some fantastic speakers and topics to present you all with. Never an easy subject, pensions, a topic that most people, when they start the working life, put to the back of their minds as a tomorrow problem. It's far too in the future to worry about and think about now. The cost of living crisis has further intensified this, with many working people having to look at every expenditure and penny and cut back on pension contributions as they need the money today, in the here and now, and not in the future when they think they've still got plenty of time to worry about that. It's kind of an out of sight, out of mind. With the inception of workplace auto-enrolment, this has further led some people to think they will be okay and that a workplace pension will solve all their problems. But they fail to realise that workplace pensions will probably not give them the pension that will sustain the standard of living that they would like. Most people don't realise quite how much they need to have in a pension pot to support their anticipated lifestyle. This seminar looks to bring the conversation to the forefront of people's minds that pensions are a today issue and something that we do need to be talking about. How much should employees consider their responsibility to inform employees that saving for a pension is important? Should employers shoulder more of the burden on paying into pension pots? And should the benefits package consider this more? Should there be a higher minimum employer contribution? The Living Wage Foundation is certainly saying there should be, and we will hear from them later in this morning. We will also hear from the Government Money and Pensions Advice Service, who will talk through how their service can help and support you and advise on what your pension could mean for you in retirement. And then finally this morning, we have two speakers who are looking at a type of pension scheme. Many of you will have heard of final salary pensions and defined pension schemes, which over the years have been eroded and replaced with cheaper schemes for employers in defined contribution, where the risk is on the employees. Our two speakers are going to be discussing collective defined contribution schemes and the potential benefits and pitfalls and what this might mean should your employer consider this as an option. The aim of this seminar is to be informative and not deemed as advice, and we welcome any questions through our chat function. We may not be able to get through all of them, but we'll certainly try. We also may consider a second session on pensions in the future, so please, any suggestions on this would be most welcome. I'd now like to introduce the speakers, and we'll let them give a brief introduction themselves to you as they give their presentations, and then we can kick off with the first half of the seminar. I'd like to welcome Paul Fox from the Government Money and Pension Advice Service, Shelley Morris from the Living Wage Foundation, Jack Jones, TUC Policy Officer and Pensions, and Derek Benstead from First Actuarial. Thank you to all of you for coming along today and speaking on this topic. I'll now hand over to Paul.
Lovely, and thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. Lovely to be with you wherever you are across the country this morning. Very brave of you, frankly, to commit an hour and a half of your day to listen to people talk about pensions. You should get a good night's sleep tonight, if nothing else. I'm going to kick off in sort of 15 to 20 minutes or so and talk really generally about pensions and some of the things that perhaps you should be thinking about or could be thinking about, but also as well as to what support and guidance is available out there for you, because pensions are absolutely incredibly overcomplicated in this country. I think it's fair to say that they always have been. For most of you who receive an annual pension statement either online or through the post from your provider, you know, it runs to sort of 25, 30 pages. And most of that is charts that we never ever look at. We simply dive down to when can we retire and how much have we currently got in our pot and what might that mean for us. So it's important to engage with your pensions earlier than most people do. So as I introduced, Paul Fox, I work for the government's Money and Pension Service, and I head up that organisation for the southwest of England. I'm talking to you from Dorset at home this morning. The Money and Pension Service sits underneath the Department for Work and Pensions. We're what's called an arm's length body. And because we're talking about pensions this morning, our funding for our pensions guidance work comes from a levy on the pensions companies, on the pensions trusts themselves. And our role it's relatively straightforward in one sense. It's to help you, to help your families have a better understanding of pensions and your pension options really right throughout your lives. And I made a very good point in her introduction about when we start to think or engage with pensions, and we just don't do it typically when we're very young. If I think back to my 20s, I was never ever going to be old. So why did I need to worry about thinking about a pension? I'm only 25. You know, I'm immortal. That's the way you kind of think about it. But you're surprising that it creeps up on you over time, and it's important to take a little bit of time each year at least to start to engage with those pensions. So, you know, looking at it, stripping it right back to basics. A pension scheme is there to help you. It's a long-term savings plan, effectively, and it's also a very tax efficient way to save during your working life. You save some of your income regularly during your working life. That gives you an income in later life when you either want to reduce the amount of time you're working or retire. That's simply the point of a pension. It's about security when you're older. There are several types of pension schemes. Some of those might be run by your employer, and I'm sure many of you on the call this morning are involved with those. Others that you can set up yourself. If you do save into one scheme, you can still save into others, and you can use other tax efficient savings plans, you know, for example, ISAs and so forth. And then when the time comes for you to start enjoying your pension, when you're actually looking to retire, you'll have several different options. These might include being able to take a tax-free lump sum, and the added security of doing that and being able to receive a regular income. You might wish to engage with what's called an annuity, so effectively an income, a set income for life, for the rest of your life. You may have options under drawdown, So you may want to take smaller amounts of your pot over particular amounts of time. And there are lots of options in between those two pillars, if you like. And they vary from scheme to scheme. It isn't going to be the case that what works for one person on this call and their particular employer looks exactly the same as it does for another person. So it is important to take a bit of time when you do get that annual pension statement, or if your employer does offer a pensions expert to come in from the particular company who host your employer's pension scheme, take an hour out to join those sessions and actually take a bit of a deeper dive into the specifics of your own pension company. Something that many people think about is how many pensions actually have I got and what do I do with them? Because gone are the days really that we go into work at the age of 18 years old or so after school, and we stay with the same employer for the next 50 or so years. That really doesn't tend to happen anymore. So for many of you on the call and many of your colleagues across your organizations, you're going to, by the time you actually do get round to retiring, you're going to possibly build up 4, 5, 6, 7 different smaller pension pots. So you've got choices, you've got options as to what you do. If we look towards the future a little bit with my crystal ball that has not a lot in it, one of the things that the government of today wants to do, and I think it will probably fall true for future governments of whatever colour as well, is that they want to try and move away from people having lots of smaller pension pots. They want to have larger pension investment funds that are better managed. And so they're able to actively invest in various sectors to develop a better return on that investment for you when you retire. But, this is all in the future. But right now, there are some things that I would highly recommend that you start to think about. I think firstly is think about where you are in terms of your age and what do you think the next 10, 20 years is going to look like. So if you are, for example, over 50 years old in this country and you have a private pension, a UK based private pension, it's important to stress that, then you are entitled to a free government pension wise appointment. And I would highly recommend that you take that up. I did mine a couple of years ago when I hit the big Hawaii 5-0, and it really is a valuable use of an hour or so. Prior to the pandemic, it was mostly done face to face for reasons that you don't need me to explain. A lot of things obviously have moved onto the telephone now or self-serve digitally, but the process is still the same. It allows you an opportunity to sit down with an expert at no cost to you and bring along your paperwork, get it all ready on your desk, have a look, and that person will take you through what different options you've got over the next 5, 10, 15 years with your pension if you're starting to think about possibly when you might want to retire. So questions such as, what tax implications might there be on the different ways that I could take my pension or my lump sum or drawdown? There's different tax issues to think about. You need to think about if you have got several pots, what guidance is there around actually amalgamating or not amalgamating? What are the pluses and minuses? At the end of the day, the final decision as to, for example, if you do merge pots has got to be down to you. As a government department, we can't offer individual financial advice to you. That has to come from a financial advisor. But what we can do is to try and demystify those big questions around pensions for you, because some of the language, for example, that's used around pensions is complex. There are phrases that we simply don't see in everyday life and that you wouldn't be used to seeing in other areas of your work life or your home life. So understanding what those phrases mean, understanding where you can actually go for help and support. A bit of a cautionary note, I think, on pensions guidance. We all these days drop onto Google for pretty much everything in life. I've actually forgotten what we did, pre-Google existing. We had a brain and we found things for ourselves, I think, but we let Google do that. So let's say you're sat down, it's a Saturday afternoon, you got a cup of tea and you're looking through your pension and you want to try and demystify it a little bit. So you drop onto Google and you start to have a look at various different things. Just be cautious when you're doing that, because there are going to be a lot of organizations who are advertising, for example, online, who would be very happy to take a commission or a fee or to sell your details onto perhaps an inappropriate provider or advisor, when actually you can come to us and get pensions guidance at absolutely no cost to yourself. So if you choose to pay for financial advice, that's absolutely different. And I would always sort of recommend people do that if they are not sure about what decisions to make. And despite headlines to the contrary, not all financial advisors charge exorbitant fees. We have on our Money Helper website, Money Helper is our main sort of consumer facing name that you might see online. There is a very, very good tool that you can find an impartial and independent regulated pensions advisor near to you. So, if you do want to go in and see somebody face to face, I'll make sure after this presentation, after these sessions today, that I get over to the Alliance of Finance, where you can find all this information. So don't worry about scribbling it all down. I'll make sure you get hold of all of this. So I spoke about pension wise. That is definitely something that all of you over 50 should be thinking about doing. Very, very much worth the time. Currently at the moment, nearly 500,000 people a year take up a pension wise interview across the country. And it really is helping people to demystify and clarify some of these complex issues. I think I want to talk for a minute or two about pensions expectations versus pensions reality. There is a clear disconnect in the country between expectations and reality when it comes to saving for your retirement. A relatively recent report by about 3,000 UK adults that were surveyed between their mid-40s and their mid-60s showed that the average target pot, as in what you would like to aspire to be in your pension pots combined when you retire, is around at about £220,000. That's what the typical person is aspiring to. But on average, the total value of personal pension pots across all schemes at the moment is about £160,000. For those people who retire at 66, a typical figure to be recommended is around and about £285,000. And that data comes in from lots of different sources. But that is what a lot of the pensions industry would say is a decent sized pot to give you a decent retirement and decent standard of living. But at the moment, the average pension pot for a retired person at retirement is around and about £70,000. So really about a quarter of that recommended requirement total. Although auto-enrolment was very, very welcomed right across the country. And to give you an example, before auto-enrolment came in over 10 years ago now, probably around and about 45% of employees in the country were actually saving into a workplace pension. That figure is now almost 80% of people are saving into a workplace pension. So there's some clearly been some very positive shifts over the last decade for people who are looking to have a more secure retirement. But there are some minimums out there. So for example, at the moment, typically it's the 8% rule. So an employer will put in 4%, you put in say 3%, and then you'll get tax relief of a percent from the government on that. It doesn't hold from employer to employer as to the different rates that they will contribute. Some of you on the call today may have employers who are much more generous than others. Typically, the average amount that an employer will contribute to a pension pot is around and about 3.5%. Although some employers, for example, have an option that they will match you up to a certain amount. So if you decide to go up to 7%, they may match you to 7%. Again, if you're not sure of the details of your scheme, ask your HR or pension providers, ask your employers directly. They should have that information available at their fingertips for you. But it's important to understand that there is something called the 1% rule, that, you know, for every 1% that you add into your, or you increase your own contributions by, that actually multiplies up using things like compound interest and investments over the long term, which are looking to become better. Then that 1% actually stands you in really good stead. And, you know, some of the ways to think about it are individual. I and my wife, for example, the way we used to think about it, you know, back in the 30s, in my 30s and our 30s, when I first started sort of really starting to think about pensions, we used to think about it in terms of an annual pay rise. And that pay rise may not have been a huge amount. It might have been 1 or 2% or whatever it was. But we always took that opportunity to try, if we could, and put a pay rise as an extra contribution into the pension scheme. And bear in mind that you can do the same, for example, if you get an annual bonus. Maybe you get an annual bonus of £1,000 or £2,000. You know, if you put £500 of that into your pension pot as a one-off payment, which for the majority of you, you'll be able to do that. Again, the government will add to that figure for you, and effectively, you know, you can almost consider that free money. And the government don't like you to use the phrase free money, but, you know, take advantage of it if you can. And of course, if you're a higher rate taxpayer, you can actually claim as well higher rate pension, excuse me, higher rate pension tax relief as well. So there are some seriously good incentives to save into your pensions. There are some things to be wary of, and I'm mindful of the time and I here, so a couple of minutes. For those of you who are in, you know, let's say 10, 15 years out from your pension, and you're starting to, you've had this pension wise conversation, maybe you've taken a bit of financial advice. There are some things to be careful of as well. Unfortunately, pension fraud is on the increase quite rapidly. So it's very, very important. Don't race for any of those. Oh, invest your pension in a chunk of Amazonian rainforest and you'll get 3 times better returns on it. The likelihood is it's a scam and you'll lose your pension pot. The pensions companies are required now, if you are transferring more than a certain amount of money, they are required to raise amber or red flags if there is anything that they find a bit potentially not necessarily suspicious, but a little bit too risky in that transfer. So, for example, if they see that, you know, you've answered an advert in the Sunday papers and you're trying to transfer your £50,000 pot again into this, you know, this Amazon rainforest scheme, that's going to raise a red flag. And that means that that transfer will be put on hold, and you will have to come and have a conversation with us at the Money and Pension Service so that we can talk to you about the risks around what you might be thinking about doing. Ultimately, the decision will be yours. However, it's important that that scheme is in place because it gives you that extra layer of security. State pensions, of course, in addition to anything you've got in your pots or different pension schemes you save into, the state pension, the age at which you can take the state pension depends on when you were born. The trend for that is to be increasing. Under current law, the state pension age is due to go to 68 between 2044 and 46, but the government's had a recent review and has announced plans to actually bring that timetable forward. So it's likely to expect that 68 figure between probably 2037 and 2039. So it's well worth as well. And some of the information I will put together for you is it's well worth contacting the government for free, and it's very easy to do, and you can find out where you are with your state pension, any years where you might have missed contributions, and make it up. So let me wrap up by saying that the Money and Pension Service is here to help any and all of you with pensions guidance. We are free, completely free, and we are independent and we are impartial. We don't just cater to employers' schemes. It may well be, let's say, that you worked in the public sector private beforehand, so maybe you've got a defined benefits scheme sat there, something. It doesn't matter. We can help you with all those inquiries. That's what we're set up and funded to do. So if there's any questions after this session, or I think it's at the end of 2 and I that you're doing them, I'll do my level best to answer them, but I will certainly send you over some really good resource and in straightforward language around your pensions after this session, and hopefully as many of you as possible and your colleagues can benefit from that. Anaya, thank you.
That's lovely, Paul. Thank you very much for that, and thank you for agreeing to send some further details over, which we absolutely will share amongst everybody that's attended the session today. Yeah, we have got some questions coming through. I can see those in the chat, but we will take those after each 2 presenters have done their presentations, if that's okay. So Shelley Morris, if I can introduce yourself now. Shelley's from the Living Wage Foundation, and Shelley, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me along today to talk about living pension. I do have some slides, so I'm just going to attempt to share those, and hopefully you'll be able to see that on the screen. Are you able to just confirm? Sorry, because I can't.
Yes, we can. I can.
Brilliant.
Yes.
All
yeah,
good.
they're there.
Great, excellent. So I just want to make sure. So thanks. And these are quite nice picture slides mostly. So hopefully not going to do death by PowerPoint here. But yeah, I'm Shelley Morris. I lead the Living Pension Standard at Living Wage Foundation, and that's what I'm just going to talk about for the next 10 minutes or so. So I'm just going to because I can't see the time. I just want to check that I'm keeping schedule, so I keep my phone. Thank you. So just a bit of background before I talk about the living pension specifically. For anyone who's not aware, just thought it'd be helpful to explain what the Living Wage Foundation is about and what we do more generally. So it's an organisation that was born of a grassroots campaign led by low-paid workers in East London over 20 years ago. So the campaign's been running a long time, and it's been hugely successful, as you can see from some of these numbers on this slide. The real living wage is the only pay rate that is calculated independently based on the real cost of living. It's recalculated every year. In October, we announced the latest rate for the year we're in now. And there are 2 rates, one for London, which is £13.15 an hour currently, and one nationally that is £12 an hour. We have over 14,500 now accredited employers, slightly higher than what's on this slide, and getting on for 500,000 workers, low-paid workers that have had their pay lifted up throughout this campaign as a result. So what we wanted to do over the last several years is to build on the success of the Living Wage campaign and look at other areas of good work and how we can work with employers that want to sort of, deliver the best offering for their employees. The first thing that we did as an organisation was to look at hours. So some of my colleagues who run another standard is called Living Hours, which is about guaranteeing minimum number of hours per week and minimum notice periods to ensure that people have enough security of hours alongside an hourly rate that will ensure they've got enough to live on. And then in the last couple of years, I've been working with colleagues and employers to look at how we try and do the same for pensions, basically, and ensure people have stability and security once they stop working as well. So I just start with the case for change. I just caveat that throughout this, I will be talking only about defined contribution schemes. So the sort of where you're building up a pension pot. I know we're going to be some of the others are going to be talking about collective defined contribution later, and there's been mention of defined benefit. Defined benefit schemes are obviously really, really good in terms of ensuring people have guarantees. But with defined contribution, because people are relying on a pot being of an adequate size, and Paul mentioned some figures there around averages. We want to make sure that those types of pension schemes that typically most people are in now, particularly in the private sector, that they will be saving enough to have a pot that will give them an adequate standard of living into retirement. So as Paul mentioned, auto-enrolment brought millions of people into saving, but the question is that minimum level enough? And the government themselves have said that they know that was just a starting point. So what we did back in 2020 is we worked with the Resolution Foundation, independent think tank, who calculate the living wage every year, and they ran they carried out a study to look at how much needs to be saved each year for somebody on a living wage or thereabouts, to ensure that they have a pot that could sort of give them the equivalent in retirement. And they looked at obviously a whole range of different factors, but in particular they made sure to look at people that are renting, both in the private and social sector, as well as those that would be fortunate enough to own their own home and have paid off their mortgage, which is what has typically been the focus for pension projection modelling in the past. And where they got to, they looked across a different range of age categories, assuming people have not got any or much saved at the point of doing those calculations. And the numbers there show what their findings were for someone starting at age 25, and then also looking at an average across age categories from 25 to 45. And that ranged from 11 to 16% of salary. And those cash numbers there are the sort of the cash numbers that were there when they did that research back in 2020. A couple of years on, in 2022, they did another piece of research to then say, based on ONS data, you know, how many people are saving at that level. And what they found, it was out of 20 million people that are in defined contribution savings at the moment. So they didn't look at anything outside of defined contribution. 16 million were not saving at even the lowest cash level that we show here. So, and that equates to 4 in 5 workers. And if you look at it for those in the lowest 10% of earnings, 95% of low-paid workers were not saving enough. So I think that just gives you a sense of the scale of the issue and why we really do feel it's an urgent area that needs attention now, and why we've been working on this over the last few years. So the living pension itself, as I've kind of covered already, but just to reiterate, it's a voluntary target that we're working with living wage employers, so employers that are already accredited living wage, that want to go further. They voluntarily sign up to help employees save more and build up enough to provide for their basic needs in retirement. So when we started developing the living pension a couple of years ago, we used that Resolution Foundation research that I mentioned, and we ran a series of consultations and a pilot with 6 employers over a period of 12 months. And in March last year, it was actually exactly a year today, it was 21st of March, we launched the new living pension standard, which is just shown here on the slide. We developed it so it can be met in one of 2 ways. So employers can either choose to accredit based on a cash benchmark, and when they do this, they are making a commitment that anyone working a 37.5-hour week will get 2,800 a year going into their pension pot, of which they as an employer commit to contributing at least 1,630 of that. What that equates to is 12% of the real living wage based on that 37.5-hour week, and 7% of that is coming from the employer. The reason we come up with those specific numbers is because we wanted to ensure that employees didn't pay more than 5% of that 12%. And the 12% is just a little above that 11% I showed earlier that's required for someone aged 25, saving from when they first start working. The 5% figure, the reason for that is because that's the level that is the default level for employees to contribute under auto-enrolment. And as a result, over the last few years, the living wage calculation has been updated to include provision for that 5%, within the annual calculation. So what I mean by that is that when we're looking at the living wage and uprating that each year to meet the cost of living, it does incorporate the need for that 5% to go into pension contributions as well. So we want to ensure that people have 95% effectively of a living wage after they've had their contribution taken out. But this is the floor, the baseline of the standard as well. And within the living pension standard, we have also built a lot of flexibility. So as Paul mentioned earlier, lots of employers approach pensions in different ways. Some of them have sort of a single contribution level, some use the government minimums, but others use a sort of scale of different levels, as many of you will possibly have access to yourselves, where if you pay a bit more, your employer pays a bit more. So we've allowed, and ultimately there is individual choice. People do have the choice to opt out as well if they want to. And people need to be able to make changes depending on where they are in their lives and other factors they need to take into account in terms of affordability. So the standard does allow that people can opt down as well as opting up, but we ask that the default contribution level, the one that people are auto-enrolled on, is either 12%, with no more than 5% coming from the employee, or the cash equivalent here is used as the benchmark. And just finally, just to explain why we have a cash benchmark as well as the percentage. This is because when we were doing consultation, particularly with some of the smaller employers in our network, they were saying, the cost of increasing to 12% for everyone in the organisation, including those on the highest pay, is quite a significant cost. But if you can focus that additional spend just on bringing everybody up to a baseline level, it allows you to raise the level for the lowest earners, but actually low to middle income earners, because as I'll come on to in a moment, when you compare with auto-enrolment, the minimum levels, to reach 2,800, you actually have to be earning around £40,000 a year to get that under the auto-enrolment minimums. So it just allows employers that want to accredit but perhaps are not in a position to do that across the board to focus that additional spend using a cash target on those on the lower to middle income levels. This is a really busy slide, so I'm not going to go through it in minute detail, but it's just quite a helpful comparison to show the difference between the living pension standard and the auto-enrolment minimums, which I've talked about and Paul mentioned earlier. So I'll probably just draw your attention to 3 key elements on here. So the first one is, as mentioned earlier, the auto-enrolment levels are 8%. We've set the living pension level at 12%. And that extra amount we do actually ask is coming from the employers. So under auto-enrolment, it requires that employers have to pay 3%. If you're using the percentage rather than the cash, then it's 7% for living pension. But the other key difference beside the percentage is the fact that that's based on the first pound earned. So under auto-enrolment, the 8% only applies on earnings that are called qualifying earnings between the level of £6,240 and £50,000, just over. Under living pension, we ask that that's made on the first pound earned, so it doesn't deduct that first 6,000 or so. And as you can see, the cash difference there as a result is quite significant. What that means in pounds and pence for somebody on a living wage doing 37.5-hour week, and I'll just say I use that as an example, but it would be prorated up or down depending if somebody worked more or less. But it's 1,300 or almost £1,400, not quite, as a cash amount annually that would go in under the auto-enrolment minimum compared to that 2,800. So it actually results in it being double the amount in cash terms for someone on that pay level. And the other key difference I just wanted to point out was that auto-enrolment, there's certain differences around eligibility depending on your earnings and your age. And what we have asked under living pension is that whilst those rules can be used in terms of who is auto-enrolled, so only those that earn over £10,000 per year and that are age 22 have to legally be auto-enrolled, we ask that everybody and employers commit to everyone, even regardless of how much they earn, and as long as they're over the age of 18, that they are given access to the same living pension level as everyone else. So the last slide, so not much more to cover now, but a lot of what I've talked about is obviously focused on the contribution target. There's just one other element to highlight with this. So as I mentioned, a lot of employers do have different levels that people can, so to give you an example, one of the employers that accredited when we launched last year, they had a fairly simple structure where people were auto-enrolled with 3% coming from the employee, 5% from the employer, which is 8% in total. And they had an option to opt up to 5% employee, 7% employer. To accredit, they were able to keep that there for existing employees, but they were required for new employees from that point onwards to enroll them at the higher level. They could still opt down if that wasn't affordable or they didn't want to stay there. But it just uses the power of inertia that has been so successful with auto-enrolment to try and get people in at a slightly higher level and hopefully keep them there. So that's one key difference in terms of how the contributions work for new employees versus existing. In terms of the coverage, this applies obviously to direct employees that work for living pension employers. But the living wage also applies, and hence the living pension as well, to any workers that work for a firm via contracted suppliers. So this will typically be security staff, catering staff, cleaning staff, people that tend to work in the premises or offer work predominantly entirely for that employer, but are not directly employed by them, to ensure that lower pay and lower pension contributions can't be outsourced. So we've just started to deliver this for the first few. They have a bit longer to do that, and we've had a couple of successes with catering and cleaning firms in the last couple of months, and we're working on rolling that out to many more over the next year or two. And then finally, a lot of this is a bit about the contribution levels, but so it's so important to ensure that people understand what it is that this is trying to achieve, what the living pension aims to do, and also where people can go to get more information if they need it, and to look at their own personal circumstances. So one of the other requirements of the standard when employers sign up is that they send a communication when they accredit, but then annually they send a follow-up communication to everyone in the organisation to ensure that they are continually reminded of what options are available to them and what the living pension is aiming to do. And it also signposts to Money Helper and to retirement living standards within that communication. Employers can choose how they do that, but we also do provide a template if it's helpful to them. So just to conclude, we launched a year ago. We have just accredited just over 30 employers now. And that's across a range of different sizes and sectors. There's been probably more, the biggest successes in terms of sectors have been, as you might imagine, financial services. So you can see some of the names on there: Phoenix Group, Aviva, Wealthify. And we've also had some financial advisory firms in the last few months, Investing Ethically, Corinthian, and then the pension consultancy firm, Issio. But we've also had quite a high number of charities and third sector, and even some hospitality firms, and we had a small retailer, Hanover Health Foods in Edinburgh, that accredited in the last couple of months. And they've all done it in a different a range of ways, and 4 of them have actually gone from doing the auto-enrolment minimums to going straight up to living pension, which has been really fantastic for their employees. So I will conclude in terms of my slides there, and then I think hopefully that will give us a bit of time for questions.
Thank you very much, Shelley. There were some really informative slides there. And again, we'll happily share those across the attendees today. Kevin, have we got some questions in the chat?
We have indeed. Thank you, everyone. Paul, start with you. Hopefully a simple one. Has PensionWise been renamed to Money Helper? And I guess all of it's covered in your resource pack anyway.
Yeah, hi Kevin. Thanks for that and for the question sender. What happened is that 5 years ago there were three government advisory bodies. So you had the Money Advice Service, you had the Pensions Advisory Service, and you had PensionWise. Those three legacy bodies were amalgamated in 2019 to become the Money and Pensions Service. The Money and Pensions Service, as a name, any organization that has the word pensions in its title, people tend to run for the hills. That was the thinking. So we needed a more consumer-friendly name to be online. So Money Helper is just our consumer-facing brand, but within that, PensionWise is still PensionWise.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, so I hope, I know, way above my pay grade, Kevin. It probably took 15 committees a year to come to that conclusion. But that's where we're at. But I'll make sure that's all very clear, as you've said, when I send out some resources later.
Okay, terrific. I'll stay with the chat first, if I may, Anya. But so, Paul, I may come back to you. The next one's for Shelley. It's quite a long question, Shelley. If you've got access to the chat, you might want to look it up. It's from Anne Ray, 1127. Our customer service staff get the living wage, and we also have a benefits package. In recent years, some staff have had to reduce pension contributions if they wanted to increase cover under one of their benefits. So this is, I guess, offsetting. Atos are quite generous in the employer contribution, but it seems wrong that staff have to choose between increasing employee benefits or voluntarily adding to their pension. Do you have a comment on this at all? It's got a couple of likes, this question.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is, I think this is talking about sort of flex benefit kind of arrangements where, obviously there's different benefits that are offered. And I guess it's about where an employer, and quite a few employers do this, they offer an overall benefits package. It's almost like you can pick and choose how you distribute that. I guess it comes back to employee choice again, and that's a decision for individual employees. I wouldn't want to comment on sort of it. Ultimately, if somebody feels that their pension contributions are more, that they want to focus more on that, I guess it gives them the option to change that over time. In terms of the standard that we're trying to do, it's a voluntary standard, and again, we try to incorporate flexibility within it so that individuals, if they don't, in that kind of arrangement, they would still be able to make those choices if they want to. And some employers do something similar, but I guess it's ultimately about, they have the amount they have to spend on the benefits package, and they're trying to give some options around that, it sounds like.
Yeah, and I think the theme already is one of it. Ultimately, it's got to be the employee's choice as well. I think what's really interesting in your presentation is you've given us a couple of figures, the 7% and the 5%, which are potentially really good targets. And for the population of people listening today who chat to the employers about these things, they're going to be interesting figures to have. Also from Anne, but I think you answered this one, Shelley, as we went through, will schemes need to change to living pension rules, or is it voluntary? I think you quite clearly said it was voluntary, but I'll let you comment. Will the living pension also be regulated by little t, capital P, capital R? And I'm not sure what that is myself.
So I think that's the pensions regulator. So the pensions regulator, I'm not an expert in what they cover, but I think they predominantly cover trust-based pension arrangements in terms of regulating those and things like pension transfers. I don't know if Paul's got anything to add on that. I'm fairly sure they're pretty heavily involved with that area of work as well. But ultimately, what we're running, as you say, is a voluntary target. It's worked really well. Just the numbers I showed earlier hopefully demonstrate the success of the living wage campaign, but also the living wage campaign has actually helped to move up the national minimum wage and the national living wage. And our hope, I guess, is that by employers that are voluntarily signing up to put their minimum contribution levels up, which is I don't think it's something that needs to be regulated. It's not really a product so much as just a standard in terms of minimum benchmark level contribution. Ultimately, over time, hopefully, if we can dream of having the same kind of success levels, it may help to do the same with the to accelerate the increases that are legislated for by the government. Paul, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, the pensions regulator, effectively, its most simple terms is that it's a public body that protects workplace pensions in the UK. They work with employers and those trusts that are running pensions so that people can save safely for their retirement. They work on protecting people's savings in the workplace. They make sure that employers put their staff into a pension scheme and they pay money into it, the automatic enrolment. They work on improving the way that workplace pension schemes are run, and they also reduce the risk of pension schemes going bust effectively and ending up in the pension protection fund. So basically, they're looking after your schemes in the workplace is simply what they do.
Okay, and you can ask one more for Paul, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So Paul, very interesting in your presentation, you used the figure which was of employer contribution of 3.5% as the average. I assume that was over the whole of the UK market and not specifically for financial services. Do you have any idea of financial services average employer contribution levels?
No, I don't have access to a figure specifically around financial services, but I love a challenge. So I will see what I can do, Kevin, to come up with a figure for the financial services sector. I can't promise, but I will have a look.
And that's if Jack or Derek don't beat you to it. So, and yeah, I'll pause there. There are more questions we've got, but perhaps leave that for the end slot. Thank you both.
Yes. Perfect. Thank you very much for that, Kevin. So if I can move on to our third presenter then today, if I can introduce Jack Jones. If Jack would like to just give a little bit of information about your position, Jack, and then your presentation. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for that, Anya. And thank you for inviting me today. It's been a really interesting session so far. I'm Jack Jones. I'm a pensions officer at the TUC, responsible for a wide range of policies to do with pensions, both state pension and workplace pensions, including what I'm going to be talking about today, which is collective DC. So just let me find my notes, and then I will start. So I thought it would be useful just to begin by saying, I mean, raising contributions is really important for us. And it's, if we were to kind of to boil down, if we could only have one single pensions policy, it would be that kind of increasing the amount of money going into pensions, and that is just reflected in kind of several motions that we've had passed at recent congresses. And that focus on encouraging employers to pay in more, either by forcing them to through increasing the minimum contribution rates, or through kind of voluntary schemes like the living pension is a really kind of high priority for us. I think, and the work that Shelley and our team have done around living pension is actually a really valuable contribution to that, both directly in terms of kind of getting employers to sign up to it, but also indirectly in giving us a really good benchmark that we can use when we're talking to employers and to government about contribution rates. But also it's really important for us that we are more ambitious than just looking at getting more money going into a system that we think is quite flawed. And we actually focus on kind of improving that pension system and offering something better than the kind of the individual defined contribution scheme that is the standard at the moment for most workers, and that's where this collective defined contribution comes in. But before I get into collective DC, I'd like to make a quick digression, partly in response to one of the questions that we had coming in before the session, I think, which said basically, my mate says property is better than pensions, and people should put their money into property, discuss, which obviously I'm quite alarmed that whenever we say things about the kind of the limitations on DC and some of the issues with DC, occasionally that gets taken into that kind of argument. And I think I've met that mate of whoever the questioner was at several pensions events, and it is always kind of phrased around that kind of DB was great, DC's rubbish. I advise people that I meet that they shouldn't join the DC scheme, they should put the money elsewhere, like for example property. I think I want to make absolutely clear that although I'm going to talk about some of the shortcomings of DC, definitely would not want it to be kind of translated into unions or the TUC think that people shouldn't join DC schemes, because that if anyone wants to save for retirement, can afford to save for retirement, if your employer is offering you a DC scheme, that's almost definitely the best way to do it. You know, to get that employer contribution, the tax relief, the being invested in a kind of a suitable, low cost, diversified kind of fund. Yeah, would absolutely not want to kind of anything that I say to be taken as saying people shouldn't go into DC schemes. But so all that kind of long caveat being made. What I'm going to talk about today, and what Derek's going to talk about after me, is collective defined contribution, which is something that we think would be a considerable upgrade on what most people are being auto-enrolled into now in their workplace pension schemes. I'm going to talk at quite a kind of high level and talk about the reasons why unions generally are quite positive about collective DC, why we think it could be useful for members, and a bit about why the finance sector is quite an interesting sector, and employers might be particularly keen on exploring CDC in finance. And then Derek's going to talk in a bit more detail about how these schemes actually work. So it would be useful to start off with a few definitions. I think we've alluded to the differences between DB and DC already, but I think it'd be useful just to kind of be clear what we're talking about. So defined benefit schemes are schemes that promise you a pension which is based on generally salary and length of service. And that pension is guaranteed for life and is usually guaranteed by a sponsoring employer. So typically these in the past have been what we call 1/60th final salary schemes, where basically for every year that you work, you will get 1/60th of your final salary each year for life in retirement. They vary. There are kind of different rates of accrual or different types of pension scheme, but that means that essentially, kind of, if you have a 40-year career, you will get 2/3 of your final salary as a pension. These used to be the default. They're now relatively uncommon in the private sector, but there are still almost 1 million people in actively contributing to DB schemes. The other main type of pension scheme we've got at the moment is defined contribution, and these do not provide a guaranteed pension. Instead, they just essentially give you on retirement a pot of money which you can use to fund your retirement. Paul has outlined the various ways you might wish to do that. But I mean, the main point here is that nothing is guaranteed, and all that you are getting when you are contributing to it is just that pot of money that you're going to use at the end to either buy an annuity or kind of sort of invest and draw some down each year. And the value of that obviously can go up or down depending on how the investments perform. And the main factors are that kind of investment performance and how much money goes in. And this is the kind of pension scheme that most people in the private sector are now saving into. There's about 14 million active members, I think. A collective DC scheme is kind of somewhere in between the two. So both the employer and the employee will contribute to a collective fund, and that is then used when people retire to pay an income for life to members of the scheme. Unlike in DB or defined benefit, the employer does not give any kind of guarantee normally. So that means that what we're talking about in collective DC is a target pension. And again, Derek's going to go into, I think, more detail on kind of how solid that aspiration is. But a lot of work goes into making sure that that is an achievable target, and that it is kind of, it gives an element of predictability and stability to members, but it's not guaranteed. So it in the worst case, it could go down. Generally, the kind of the mechanism for responding to underfunding is that there will be, the schemes won't give a full increases each year if it's not able to do so. There are currently no collective DC schemes in operation in the UK. We're very close to opening the doors on one at the Royal Mail, but it's a very new form of pension in the UK, but it does exist and has existed for some time in other countries like the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, Canada. So it's new to the UK, but not entirely novel. There are a range of ways theoretically that you can deliver this kind of collective DC scheme. And there are a range of different types of collective DC scheme. So the one that we've almost got off the ground at Royal Mail is a single employer trust-based scheme. kind of like your old-fashioned single employer DB trust-based schemes, suitable for large employers. We've got now legislation in place for employers to open this kind of scheme. And yes, there's been, again, Derek's going to go into this muddy, but a lot of work at the Royal Mail to design a scheme and to design legislation to enable that scheme. Other forms that are potentially in the pipeline and which we've got regulation as being kind of written, or legislation is being written at the moment to enable them. Multi-employer master trusts offer CDC, so essentially schemes like Nest could offer a collective DC scheme which is open to any employer to join, or even to individuals to join. Sector-wide schemes, I think there's a lot of potential there in some sectors like social care, maybe utility companies, where you could have, again, there are kind of DB equivalents where you have these big sector-wide schemes in the past. We think you could have a collective DC equivalent now. And then the last option is kind of a what's called a decumulation vehicle. So essentially people who have built up a pot in individual DC could have the option to take that part, and instead of using it to buy an annuity or investing it individually and drawing down, it would go into a collective fund, which would then pool that kind of longevity risk and pay benefits to members of that fund. You wouldn't get all the benefits of collective DC because you wouldn't get the kind of the benefits of being able to invest over a really long time horizon, but you would get that kind of pooled longevity risk. So we think there's certainly potential there for decumulation only collective DC to play a good role as well. So why do we think that collective DC is good? Why do we think it would be an improvement on individual DC? I mean, the first one is it provides a pension. So when we talk to members about what they want from a workplace pension, it always becomes quite clear quite quickly that what they want is a predictable income that's going to last as long as they do. And DC doesn't necessarily offer that at the moment. As I've said, it doesn't offer that predictability because the value of it is not very predictable, and also it doesn't necessarily give you that income for life unless you make an active decision to go and buy an annuity. Whereas with the CDC scheme, it is what most people think of when you think of a pension. It's something which will pay out an income for life in retirement. It would also, in most cases, provide a higher pension than individual DC. Now, there's a range of analyses about just how much better, but we think of ones that show you get about 30% more pension for every kind of pound you put in than individual DC seems very plausible. And that mostly comes from the fact that you can invest kind of like a defined benefit scheme. Large scale collective funds with a really long investment horizon. You can just invest in a much smarter way than you can with an individual DC scheme, where you don't have the kind of the same length of investment time horizon, and also through this pooling of longevity risk at the end. So people don't need to oversave to make sure they don't run out of money at the end, because that's all pooled collectively. I mean, next thing, and this is kind of a point I often make. I don't see other people making it very often, but I think it is quite an important one, is that it's much harder with collective DC to offer a rubbish pension than it is with individual DC, because the focus is on the outcome rather than the input. So in DC, it's really hard to know for a lot of people, is what my employer is offering a good pension, because it's expressed as a 3% of salary or 10% or something like that. And you're trying to make a comparison there with other employers, what they might offer, but you don't really know what that actually means for what you're going to get out at the end of it. Whereas CDC translates that into a retirement income. So you can see, what does my employer say that I'm going to get in retirement? And you can make that judgment. And it means that if your employer is offering 3% going into a collective DC scheme and saying, this will give you, 1/180th of your salary for every year that you work as an income in retirement, that's not very good. You can see, okay, so if I work 45 years, that's then going to give me a quarter of my salary as a retirement income. You recognize that is not good enough in a way that you can't necessarily recognize if you're talking about contribution rates and percentages. So I think the fact that it would just put upward pressure on contribution rates, because it puts the onus slightly back onto employers to make sure that they're actually offering a decent pension scheme, is quite a useful feature of it, I think. Another point that we like is the fact that it doesn't need any kind of active engagement from members. People generally now get defaulted into a pension scheme. They stay in the default fund in terms of what the investments are, and they keep the default contribution rate. That's just how auto-enrolment works, and it's kind of what the success of it is built on. What we have at the moment, and again, Paul kind of laid this out well in his talk, we've got something where you reach retirement and suddenly that default option isn't really there. You're expected to make quite complex decisions which will, potentially, if you go to an insurer and you retire, you're thinking about locking in for, maybe 30 years or more. Or if you don't decide to do that, decisions where you're going to have to revisit those decisions quite often, and you're going to have to keep making decisions throughout your retirement as you get older. And that's just not what our system is built on in the accumulation stage when you're building up that pension. And it just seems really odd that suddenly now you flip around at retirement and you have to suddenly start making active decisions. So the fact that collective DC takes that away from you and just kind of says you will have it will deliver you a pension in retirement, and it will do that without you needing to actually kind of make active decisions, is really quite important. And that kind of brings on to the next point I've got, which is that there's a potential for good governance in collective DC, in that who is making that decision. And if you're not making it individually, it's being made by trustees who are responsible for overseeing that scheme. And we do have to make sure, because I mean the legislation and regulation is still being written around this, but we do have to make sure that there is a role for member nominated trustees in the oversight of collective DC schemes. But if we can do that, then we can have confidence that the people that are taking that decision are doing so with members' interests at heart. And it's quite paternalistic, but it is basically what people seem to want. They want to know that their money is being looked after by somebody who's got their interests at heart and will make decisions based on their interest rather than anything else. Next point I've got that we good things we like about TDC is its potential for it to build up workers' capital. And again, this is quite a uniquely probably trade union kind of stance or positive in it, but pension funds in theory give workers leverage over the economy by owning a chunk of it, essentially. And as unions, we like to try to find ways of using that leverage to influence employers to have high environmental, social, employment standards, things like that. And it's partly because we believe obviously that is in the interest of working people and of union members, but also because it is long term, it's good for business to be a good company, essentially. And more kind of individualist DC systems, they significantly dilute the ability to do that, whereas collective large scale funds just give, again, you can see the difference in how defined benefit schemes act as employers and can be used to influence the economy. And CDC kind of gives that similar kind of, there's a potential there to make large scale collectively owned and managed funds that will give workers a bit more control over the economy in ways that I think could be quite exciting for us in the future. And kind of linked to that as well, and this is the last point I've got, I think I had 7 points in the end. It's also useful for the government in promoting their policy aim of kind of boosting investment in the UK economy, in what they call the productive economy, a lot of which involves kind of investing in illiquid assets, basically things like infrastructure. And there's a lot of interest from both Conservatives and Labour in finding ways to get more pension scheme money into those kind of assets. And again, funds that are bigger and that have a really long time horizon, because they can effectively, they're intending to kind of to run on forever, are much more suited to investing in that kind of thing. So there's a kind of like, there's a boost for workers in that we could use these funds to kind of give us a lever over the economy, but also a boost for government in their aim of just getting more money into funding things like UK infrastructure. So moving on to kind of looking at why we think it's particularly interesting to talk about collective DC in the finance sector. And I know, looking at Derek's slides that are coming up, there are some quite technical answers to this. But the two answers that I'm going to give are one, and again, this comes back to the question you're asking just before I start speaking, actually, around kind of contribution rates. Contribution rates in the finance sector are generally quite high compared to the economy at large. Which means that there's more room there to do interesting stuff there's more potential to look at doing something better than the bare minimum. And also on the employer side, it means there is more interest in employers saying, okay, we're putting in more than the legal minimum, we're putting in more than maybe we need to, we want to make sure we get the best possible return from that. And that's where we think a conversation can be started around collective DC, and using that as a way to make employers differentiate themselves, make themselves more attractive, get more return on that pension contribution that they make on behalf of members. I did have a look at kind of the figures for this. So unfortunately, ONS do a slightly annoying thing where they don't really do averages. They do kind of contribution buckets. So what we can say looking at the ONS stats is looking at the kind of UK workforce as a whole. Over half the population, or over half the workforce, get employer contributions of 4% or less, and a significant chunk, another 22%, are in the kind of the next contribution bracket, which is 4 to 8%. So we know that kind of across the population as a whole, 3/4 of people are in schemes that get employer contributions of less than 8%. Whereas in the finance sector, there are very few people in that kind of, or there are fewer. Only 10% of people in the finance sector are getting less than 4% from their employer, and only 21% are in that 4 to 8% bracket. So what it means is you've got loads more that are in that kind of what is the top end of a DC contribution, where you've got 20% of people getting 12 to 15% contributions from their employers, and 14% getting 15 to 20% from their employers. So essentially, you've got kind of a third of the workforce in finance are in that 12% plus kind of bracket, whereas in the workforce at large, there's about 5%. I think it's a 1 in 20. So there's just a lot more scope there for saying, okay, we've got people who are getting good contributions. Can we do more with that? And then the linked point to that is there is generally, and I think people in this room have probably got a better idea than I do about this, but there is generally quite a lot of quite good constructive relationships with employers, I think, in the finance sector. That's partly reflected in it seems like there are a larger number of collective bargaining agreements which extend to pensions within the finance sector. And they are relatively rare, again, kind of in the labour market at large. So I think, again, there's an extra lever there that unions can use, or an extra way in which they can get collective DC conversations started with employers. And I think that's it for my notes. So I'll hand over to Derek now, or back to you, Anya.
Thanks very much, Jack. That's great. Is there some of those statistics there that you can share with me and we can share around after the session?
Yep, happy to do that.
Great, thank you. Derek, over to yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I shall bring up some slides. So if we just pause while I click my way through.
Yeah, we can see them, Derek.
Lovely. There you are. Okay, so let's introduce myself. Derek Benstead. I'm an actuary working at First Actuarial. In my day-to-day work, I spend some of my time advising pension trustees on the running of their pension schemes. I spend some of my time helping employers negotiate with their pension trustees on the running of their pension scheme. And I also spend quite a lot of my time working with trade unions who are negotiating on pensions with the employers of their members. So the two highest profile things I've been doing in recent years is helping University and College Union in the discussions about university superannuation scheme. The UCU is part of the formal governance structure of the USS, and the USS has been a point of discussion, unfortunately, for 10 years or more now in the way it is run. And I've also advised the Communication Workers Union about pensions at Royal Mail in the negotiations that led to the proposal for a collective defined contribution scheme at Royal Mail. So I'll be sort of drawing on the things we did with Royal Mail in part of my presentation. So let's start with where we are with defined benefit schemes and individual DC schemes. So defined benefit schemes, be they final salary schemes or career average schemes, provide members with an income for life. The cost efficiency of a pension scheme depends mostly on how well it is invested. Investments for growth can help keep the costs down or the pensions up. Defined benefit schemes traditionally were invested for growth, but in recent years, as the world turns risk averse, have been increasingly cautiously invested, and that has tended to put the cost of a defined benefit scheme up. They provide reliable benefits for members, which is great, but the cost for employers has been increasingly expensive for employers over the past 5, 10, 20 years, and escalating costs have put employers off their defined benefit schemes. Intergenerational fairness is a topic often raised in the context of pensions. For the members of a defined benefit scheme, they're all earning the same pension each, commonly a 60th of pay per year or an 80th of pay per year, something like that. But if you haven't got access to a defined benefit scheme because it has been closed to new entrants, that's intergenerationally unfair. Longer serving older people might still have a defined benefit scheme that they're earning pension in. Newer recruits can't get in because the doors have been shut, and that's not fair. Looking at contributions, contributions for active members of defined benefit schemes. In many schemes in recent years, active members' contributions have shot up. So such remaining people as are in DB schemes might be paying rather higher contributions than previous generations of members of that scheme used to pay. In the world of individual DC schemes, they are an investment account, not a pension at all, unless and until the member buys an annuity from an insurance company when they retire to convert their pot into an income for life. And the price of annuities depends greatly on the state of the financial markets, particularly bond markets. Up until a couple of years ago, annuities were very expensive, and retirement outcomes from a DC scheme not all that good. In the last couple of years, annuities have got cheaper again, so DC outcomes looking a bit better than they were in the recent past. But so the cost efficiency of DC, very variable depending on the state of the markets. Doesn't provide a reliable benefit at all. I'll be showing a chart later as to how hugely unreliable DC retirement outcomes are. But it is a dependable contribution. At least you know what you're paying. Intergenerational fairness of DC as a benefit outcome. That dreadful variability of retirement outcome means that one generation does much better or much worse than another. So that's intergenerationally unfair as a benefit outcome. Though, of course, as regards contributions, if everybody's paying the same from one generation to the next, that's fair. So there are different ways in which pension schemes are fair or unfair, depending how you look at it. Coming along to defined benefits in the finance sector, it's very difficult for banks and building societies to continue to provide defined benefits, given the way that they're regulated by the Prudential Regulation Authority. The PRA focuses on the pension accounting standard for the way pensions are disclosed in finance sector accounts. That accounting standard is extremely unrealistic and artificial, and therefore is not a helpful way to regulate the provision of defined benefits in the finance sector. And the requirement of the PRA for an employer to hold additional reserves on their accounts, in addition to the assets already in the pension scheme, if there is so-called investment risk in the pension scheme, that is not helpful. That makes it more difficult for banking and building society employers to provide DB. It makes them less willing to provide DB. So you're swimming against the tide in the finance sector, trying to continue with defined benefits. So let's move along and begin to work our way towards collective DC, what it is and what it looks like as a concept compared to DB. So in defined benefit world, we define some benefits, say a 60th or an 80th of pay for each year of service. We do an actuarial valuation to calculate the value of those benefits and decide what the contribution rate needs to be in addition to the assets to pay for those benefits. And the contributions calculated by an actuarial valuation over the last 10 or 20 years have been hugely variable, got increasingly expensive for employers, and there's been a very difficult way to run a pension scheme purely by varying the contribution rate alone. In a collective DC scheme, then we define the contribution being paid into the scheme, but what we don't do is define the benefits. We carry out an actuarial valuation just as if we were running a defined benefit scheme, but the inputs to the valuation are the contributions and the assets, and the output from the valuation is the benefits that we can afford from those assets and contributions. And the objective of the valuation is to spend all the money in the scheme on the benefits for the members, but those benefits are not guaranteed. We vary those benefits up and sometimes down, such that the value of the benefits equals the value of the assets and the contributions that we have available to spend. So moving along to the example of collective DC at Royal Mail, when that pension negotiation started, Royal Mail had a DB scheme that was closed to new entrants, an open individual DC scheme for new recruits, and at the time, back in 2017-ish, there was something like 80,000 members in the closed DB scheme and 40,000 members in the open DC scheme. Royal Mail as an organisation is not financially strong. The bulk of its workforce are the posties who put letters through your door every day. The Royal Mail as an organisation doesn't own a lot of assets relative to the size of its 140,000 workforce. It's not a good employer for sponsoring DB. So the Royal Mail DB scheme was very cautiously invested. The contributions were exceedingly high, and Royal Mail understandably opened a consultation to close their DB scheme for all benefit accrual and put everybody in individual DC. The Communication Workers Union were very keen that their members should, in retirement, receive an income for life, not an investment pot, and for that income for life to be sufficient to give dignity in retirement. So the CWU came to us and asked us to work out just how could Royal Mail provide a pension to postal workers. That is the job, after all, of the pension industry, to provide pensions. And you know, if we are expert at that, that is what we should show how to do. So we looked at Royal Mail's accounts, very quickly saw that Royal Mail was not a good candidate employer for providing a fully defined benefit pension scheme. So the CWU brought to the negotiating table a proposition for a defined benefit scheme where the annual increases on the career average pension were not guaranteed but were variable, and the proposition was to use those variable increases to control the funding of the scheme, to grow the pension liabilities in a way that matched the value of the assets. So rather than change the contributions all the time that Royal Mail couldn't afford, you changed how quickly the benefits went up to match the value of the benefit to the value of the assets. So Royal Mail management, to their credit, took that idea on board, and over a period of 6 to 9 months or so was explored between the Royal Mail's advisors and CWU advisors. And where the negotiation settled on was a collective DC pension of an 80th of pay and a defined benefit cash sum on top of the pension of 3/80ths of pay. So this structure, 80th pension plus 3/80ths cash, was a copy of the existing Royal Mail defined benefit scheme, but in collective DC world, the pension is no longer guaranteed. So the amount of benefit guarantee being offered by the post office was greatly scaled down because Royal Mail simply wasn't a great employer for promising a defined benefit. So what does the scheme, a CDC scheme, look like? Well, in the Royal Mail's case, as an example, it's a career average pension, just like you might be used to in the world of defined benefit pensions. It provides partner pensions, lump sum death benefit, early and late retirement options, just like you'd be used to in a defined benefit scheme. In the Royal Mail scheme, the pension builds up as an 80th of pay for each year of service. That looks very familiar, but there are other ways of doing it, which I will come to. But the important thing in a collective DC scheme is the pensions are not guaranteed. The pensions can go down as well as up, and that's the vital thing to grasp. So if there's no defined benefit guarantee, there's no need to vary the contributions. That employers don't like having to accommodate variable contributions, but instead you manage the scheme by changing how fast the pensions increase or sometimes decrease. So in the example of the Royal Mail, the modelling that was done in preparing the Royal Mail scheme initially targeted annual increases on pensions of CPI plus 1%, and the modelling suggested whether you either looked backwards into history or forwards using stochastic modelling, a range of pension increases of around CPI minus 2% to CPI plus 4%. So CPI plus 4 in the good times, when you're spending good returns on members, CPI minus 2 in the bad times when investments have not performed very well. So quite a significant range of annual increases there, but that's what keeps the benefits that you're paying in line with the assets and contributions that you have available. And one critical thing about CDC is everybody is in it together. So you don't single out pensioners for special treatment. You give the same increase or sometimes a decrease to everybody, whether they're an active member or a deferred or a pensioner member. And that's a requirement of CDC law, just to make it absolutely certain that everybody gets treated the same. So how does collective DC work out in comparison with individual DC? This is a chart that takes nearly 100 years of past investment performance and looks at how well a CDC scheme would have done given a 16% of pay contribution and a 40-year career, and how well individual DC would have done given the same 16% contribution and a 40-year career. So after a 40-year career, retiring in 1965, we see on the left there a CDC pension on the blue line, just under 50% of pay, an individual DC pension, not very different. But as we go forward in time for retirements in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and so on, getting nearer up to the present day, we see that the range of retirement outcomes in individual DC world is hugely variable, as high as getting on for 80% in 2000, a bit under 20% in the 1980s, early 80s, late 70s. So a 4-to-1 ratio of benefit outcomes for the same contribution history in the same career is hugely unreliable for the members, and not at all great if you're one of the people retiring on 20% of pay. Collective DC pensions are more reliable, but there's still a range of outcomes. So the outcome on the right-hand side of the chart, it's about 72% of pay outcome, is half as big again as the outcome on the left-hand side of the chart, retiring in the 60s and 70s at 48% of pay. So collective DC doesn't give a certain outcome. It's a variable outcome, but what it does do is give you an outcome that you can rely on in the short term. So the blue line, yes, it changes over time, but it changes slowly over time. So if you've got a friend who retired a couple of years before you on a similar kind of salary and service history, a couple of years later, you'll get much the same pension, give or take a bit. Whereas in DC world, individual DC world, the pension can vary hugely over short periods of time. So different ways of doing collective DC. The 80th pay for each year of service, like Royal Mail, is suitable for a scheme with only one employer. The important thing to note, of course, is that the contributions you are paying don't necessarily match the value of the benefit if you stick to an exact 1/80th of pay for each year of service. So you wouldn't share a scheme like that with several employers and end up with cross subsidies between them. So if you had, in a second example, a scheme that was open for many employers to join, then you would calculate the pension build-up rate for each employer. So all the employees of that employer got the same build-up rate. And you might do that calculation once a year, so that if an employer joined and you calculated in the first year that their employees could have a pension of an 80th of pay for that year, then the following year, if financial markets had got more expensive, then you might find you could only afford a 90th of pay for the next year. Or if financial markets had got cheaper, you might afford a bigger pension of a 70th of pay. But what you would do is change the build-up rate every year to keep the value of the benefits being added equal to the contributions being paid. The third way of doing collective DC is not to work out the pension for each employer, but to work out the pension for each member individually. So you would look at the contributions paid by that member or by the employer of that member and convert it into a CDC pension using age-related actuarial factors. So we're familiar with the concept on retirement of swapping pension for tax-free cash. This is the actuarially identical concept in reverse of swapping a cash contribution for a CDC pension. And that could be a more suitable approach if you're exchanging if an employer is replacing an individual DC scheme with a collective DC scheme. So if you've got a collective DC scheme where the pension isn't guaranteed, just how safe is that for members? The first thing I would say is having a pension provides protection, and not having a pension does not provide protection. So even though the pension is not guaranteed, better for the reliability for your retirement planning to have a pension than to have an investment pot with a highly uncertain outcome. And if you're at an employer with a closed DB scheme and an open DC scheme, then the intergenerational fairness of that employer closing both schemes and putting everybody into CDC, that's much better if everybody is in one scheme rather than having older, longer serving people in DB and younger, shorter serving people in DC. The various things that will protect members in the running of CDC, consistency of applying the annual increase or decrease every year is important. There'll be a benefit management strategy that will be published for people to read so that everybody will be able to see whether the scheme is being run properly or not. So benefit increase policy, actuarial advice, publish it on the internet. That's a requirement of the legislation. And then anybody who wants to read that information, be it a member who wants to educate themselves, or perhaps more critically, a representative union, making sure that the scheme is being run properly, or anybody in a think tank or a consultant running a survey, that's an important protection to make sure that the scheme is being run properly, on top of the professionalism of the actuary giving the advice and the trustees scrutinising that advice, the pensions regulator scrutinising what the trustees have decided. So a number of layers of scrutiny, and I'd certainly be strongly recommending that unions involve themselves in the running of a CDC scheme, either by nominating member trustees or indeed having union trustees on the trustee board, and by just actively following what is published, the published documents on the internet. So coming back to where I started, how does collective DC fit against some important objectives for a pension scheme? It provides an income for life, which is great. As Jack was saying, it's what most people want from a pension scheme, an income for life, not a pot. Because there's no benefit guarantee, you can invest for growth. And indeed, you should invest for growth, because a better return from the investments equals better pensions for the members. So that makes for cost efficiency a good pension outcome for the contributions going in. We saw that the benefit was quite reliable in the short term, albeit variable in the long term. So yes-ish to the reliability of benefit criterion. There is reliable contributions because the contributions going in are defined. Intergenerational fairness of collective DC. Yes, the benefits are variable from one generation to the next, but far better from a fairness point of view to have everybody in the same kind of scheme providing a pension for life than to have the privileged few in a DB scheme and the majority in a DC scheme. And finally, legislating for CDC. I was trying to get rid of something on my laptop here. Right. Legislating for CDC. The Pension Schemes Act 2021 was the primary law that facilitated CDC. The regulations for single employer CDC are in place, subject to one or two final tweaks that the Royal Mail is demanding. We should see the Royal Mail CDC scheme starting up later this year. Regulations for multiple employer CDC schemes, a consultation on them should start soon. Should have started before Christmas, but there's been some delays at the DWP, and these will facilitate more flexible CDC design, such as I was describing, each employer having their own pension build-up rate, or each employee having their own CDC pension calculation equal to the value of the contributions they have paid. So that's the end of my presentation about CDC. Hopefully giving you a good flavour of what it's all about, and how it might help provide the provisions of pensions in future.
Thank you very much, Derek, for that. And again, we will share that presentation amongst everybody that's attended today. Some interesting facts there, and probably gives the union something to think about and potentially start discussions with the recognised employers. Kevin, have we got any more questions that have come in?
I can't see anything on the chat particularly. I'm going to start with Derek, if I may, Derek. I'm just thinking, how big is the sell to those that are deferred, to someone who's just about to retire? Let's take the post office example, so the postal workers example. So they've been paying into a DB scheme. They believe the contract is for a DB pension, and now we're going to go, surprise, it's a CDC thing, which is really good for everybody else that's coming on board, but for you it's going to come down a little bit and may vary again over time instead of a guarantee. I can see why you need that, because you need everyone in the same, you need that equity of that money. But how do you sell that?
I think the important thing here is that Communication Workers Union. They are well known as being a strong union that strongly defends its workers' rights in the workplace. And this is a pension scheme that's not imposed by the Royal Mail. This is a pension scheme negotiated by the CWU. So a lot will depend on the CWU carrying its own members. So yeah, the Royal Mail proposition was to go individual DC for everybody, which is investment pots. What we have here is a pension scheme, not a pot. So yes, it's not guaranteed, but it's something that Royal Mail can reasonably expect to provide. So it will be interesting to see in the next 6 months or so when the scheme goes live, what individual reactions there are from union members or indeed non-union members. I would hope it is going to be positive, that people recognise the benefit of being offered a pension, not a pot.
Okay, thank you. A good question from Suzith. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. What does a CDC do with potential fund surpluses? Do they get shared back with pensioners?
Yes, so if you do your actuarial evaluation and show that there's a bit of a surplus compared to the benefit expectations that you last communicated, then you uprate the annual increase to everybody's pensions, and everybody gets a share of that surplus, not just the pensioners. Actives, deferreds and pensioners all get the same increases or decreases. So in practice, what you are doing in the actuarial management is you're never running a surplus, never running a deficit. You always adjust benefits to keep them in line with the assets and contributions that you have available to spend. If the money is there, you spend it on the members. You don't hold it back and you don't overspend.
And if a company, when it sort of found itself in really hard times and sort of faced, I guess, liquidation or the like, is there a huge vulnerability for the pension that would or wouldn't be there if it was DC only?
As we speak today, you know, if Royal Mail started their CDC scheme and Royal Mail went bust a year later, so in practice to get rescued by the government if it did. You know, but if it went bust a year later, it would have to disaggregate and give everybody an individual DC pot. So the actuary would run a share fund calculation so that everybody got a fair share of the fund, and it would end up back as an individual DC scheme, which if you hadn't started CDC is what you would have had. So
Okay.
in the ideal world, and I keep nagging DWP about this, there'd be multi-employer master trust CDC schemes that can take bulk transfers in, so that if a single employer CDC scheme, the employer went bust, all the trustees have to do is bulk transfer their scheme into a master trust CDC scheme, so the benefits can carry on being CDC.
Yeah, I certainly see the logic of that.
We're not there yet legally, but if a master trust CDC comes to market, that would become possible.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to whip to Jack now, if that's okay. So Jack, you quoted a figure and I missed it, so I'm fearful others may have as well. You were saying how many people were in DB schemes in terms of millions who are currently contributing to DB schemes. What was that figure, and was that the finance sector only, or was it bigger market?
No, I think I said almost 1 million. I think the actual number is 930,000, or the last ones I've seen, and that is across the whole private sector workforce.
Yeah, that's quite small.
Yeah, and I suspect very, very few of those are in finance. I think kind of the finance sector was one of the ones that started moving to DC quite early.
Yes, so 200,000 of those are USS on its own, University Superannuation Scheme.
Quite a lot of railways as well. I think about
80,000 are Royal Mail in the closed DB scheme. And I guess you were mentioning railway workers. That must be another 100,000 or more, mustn't it? So 120,000 in the railways industry, something like that.
Something like that. Yeah, it is largely kind of quasi-public sector now. Most of the large ones that are open, certainly, and a handful of smaller ones and employers like unions that have got a particularly strong attachment to DB.
And a question from Fiona, I don't mind which of you, if you both answer this one, what do you anticipate the appetite for CDCs will be with employers once CWU scheme goes live? And perhaps if you want, you can add to that. Again, remember our audience, we're across the AFF affiliates. You may have sparked interest amongst our listeners. What counsel do you have for the listeners who haven't looked at CDC with their employer yet? So if you can put it in that context as well between you, that'd be great.
You go first, Jack, or shall I go first?
I'll go first. So you've probably got more
please.
direct contact with employers that you can talk to, but yeah, I think it will be relatively like Royal Mail scheme is a niche. I think it's kind of, there will be relatively few employers of the scale that would say that will be actively looking at that now. I mean, I am aware of quite a lot of conversations where employers often have quite, again, are in that Royal Mail kind of situation of having a decent chunk of employees in a DB scheme, but new members who are going into a DC scheme where there's a possible kind of interest there. I think the interest will only really come if it's forced a little bit by unions. If we talk about this a lot, I think that could certainly make a big difference. But also once you do get the other option, if Nest became a collective DC scheme, then I think it almost wouldn't matter so much what the appetite was at any particular employer. People would just choose it. If it was just an option on the shelf. So I think, yeah, I don't know. I'll be interested in what Derek has to say about whether there are a lot more Royal Mails out there that are really actively looking at setting up their own individual single employer scheme. But I think there would just automatically be a lot of, and also I think if you could say make Nest CDC, it would also put a lot of pressure on all the other individual DC master trusts. I think if it did work as well as we think it would, and offering a better option, I think it would really generate a lot of momentum within the provider side of the market rather than necessarily the employer side of the market, just to keep up with that employer demand. And I think one area where, again, unions could do a lot of work to try and create demand is in these sectors where, I don't know if this really applies very much to the finance sector, but sectors where a single sector-wise scheme would be potentially appropriate. I think I mentioned social care and utilities as areas where that might be a particular interest at the moment, but there are a few more. But I think there, again, there's a lot of dancing around at the moment of people talking behind the scenes and not wanting to show their hand before legislation is even in. But yeah, I think, and again, there's definitely a role for unions there to really push that and to show that there is a demand from members for it.
Thank you, Jack.
Translate what members want into a specific demand for collective DC, I guess. Okay,
thank you, Jack. Derek?
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo all of Jack's comments. I've not got a lot to add to them. I have a client of my own that employs about 2,000 people that before the single employer CDC regulations were written, were keen to start single employer CDC, but now they're waiting for a multi-employer scheme so the startup burden can be shared. Jack mentioned employers that are in sectors that are already used to sharing their pension scheme. So the housing sector is a prime example. I very much hope to see a housing sector, social housing CDC scheme. Housing employers are used to sharing in social housing pension scheme and local government pension scheme. That'd be ideal for CDC. I have heard plenty of whispers of people thinking about it in utility companies. Is one example. Railways potentially is another example of an industry with industry-wide DB provision that could go CDC. Church of England, I heard today, is announcing it's going CDC. Not that I've tried Googling it yet to see what's been said publicly, but I heard that today. Yes, there is lots of thinking and watching, but what we don't want is the pensions regulator to regulate CDC out of existence before it starts, and there is that danger. But but collective DC really ought to be of interest, I think, in the finance sector, because there's a fine tradition of DB provision in the finance sector, but it's very difficult given the way they're regulated. Surely there has to be good scope for CDC in the finance sector. But like Jack says, if union reps raise it for discussion, that will certainly help bring employers along.
Okay.
Can I come back on this question, Kevin, quickly? Just because one thing occurred to me, I should have mentioned. Government is currently consulting on potentially easing how employers can get their hands on surpluses in closed DB schemes, which is a bit of a sensitive issue. But there's a potential there for saying, well, there's an argument that's been put forward, and they're actually looking at the consultation of, well, what if we let employers get their hands on some of their DB surplus, which has suddenly arisen in the last couple of years, in exchange for giving a higher DC contribution, which it's a little bit hard to kind of figure out how that would actually work. But we are looking at whether we should be arguing in that maybe if people were allowed to access that DB surplus, a more sustainable kind of use for it would be to like set up costs and seeding a collective DC scheme. And that's a change which might suddenly make it a lot more attractive to a lot of employers that are sitting on a large old DB scheme that suddenly has a very significant surplus in it. If it was tied to a kind of, setting up CDC was tied to getting their hands on some of that surplus, that could be a way of certainly making it look more attractive all of a sudden.
Okay. Anya, I've had no more questions in, but I've got a sort of wrap up one if you allow me. So this is for all of you. Fine. And you can each choose how you answer it. So it's got 3 bits to it, and you can take all 3 or just one of them. So it starts with the whole thing around obligations. So employer obligations, communicate, educate, train, annual communications, the trust groups, etc. So any comment in terms of how that's being fulfilled, or how, again, our audience can ensure that's fulfilled. The other side of that coin, employee obligations. So Paul, you touched on this a lot, and your resource pack, from what I've seen, is going to be great help for people. But do employees do enough? And Jack, you really nicely underlaid this of saying why CDC is attractive, because you can be passive in it, because by far the majority of people are passive. Some people don't even understand anything about their pension elements, So employer obligations, employee obligations, and the third one, if you want it, or choose just to do this one, as you look forward in your crystal ball, what do you see, or what would you like to see? I think, Derek, you've already had this one, sorting out the regulator. What do you see, or what would you like to see in terms of the pension market? And I really want to try and tie that one down to the finance sector. Do you accept the challenge? And Shelley, would you like to go first?
Just running my unmute button there first. So to try and answer all of those, or
just pick one. I'm only going to give you a couple of minutes.
Okay,
so,
great.
That
it's quite a lot to cover, but I think I'll probably focus on employer obligations, and maybe just with the crystal ball, or what you would like as a final point. So, I mean, I think your point around communication is really important, and that was the reason why, although we are predominantly, when we set up Living Pension, we were trying to replicate the simplicity of living wage in terms of having a very clear target and being very focused on a target, so that that could be communicated easily and effectively to both employees and employers, and but also that obligation is there on employers to make sure they're communicating that every single year and reminding people, particularly where maybe they've opted out, or they have chosen a lower contribution option, that they're reminded of the fact that they do have the option to opt back in or to choose a higher contribution. We do also ask, actually, if employers are willing and able, and many are, although we stop short of making it a requirement of the standard, that if they're they can make contributions for on the employer side, even when employees can't afford it in the short term, that they continue to do that, and many are doing that, and that sort of again keeps that employee engaged, even if they have a short-term affordability issue, because they've still got money going in their pension and can see the impact, and that's a motivator for continuing and perhaps going back to that. And I guess in terms of the outcomes, what would be nice to see, kind of just, I'm not going to give a view on what type of pension it is, but I think whether it's DC, which we've tended to focus on, or other anything else, I think just even within DC, there's so many different options available to individuals at the moment. It would be good across all of them to have this more outcome focused approach that just makes it a bit easier for people to make decisions when it comes to retirement, so they can rely upon their pension more.
Terrific, Shelley, thank you. And pretty good, just over the 2 minutes, but pretty near. Paul, you're next. Again, if you can make that 1 minute 50 seconds, I'll be even happier.
Okay, I will do so. Kevin, thank you. So employer obligations, what I would like to see across the financial services sector is all employers providing much better signposting to pensions guidance as part of a more holistic financial wellbeing strategy for their employees. And if any organisations wish to make contact with me, I have counterparts across the country who can help large employers with that. On the employee obligation front, there is way too much apathy out there. And with an aging population, there are likely to be a third more people reaching state pension age by the 2040s. You need to start engaging with your pensions. They might not be super exciting, but hopefully some of the stuff I can send over to you will help that. And the crystal ball piece, something to look out for in the sector. It actually affects the whole of the country, but well worth having a heads up now. We are currently working on the pensions dashboard. I don't know if you're aware of that. The pensions dashboard is currently due to go live, I believe, second half of 2026, and it will allow everybody in the sector to ascertain far more clearly how they are set for the future. It will bring all their pension pots and the state pension, all of this information into one hub, and they will get a much clearer view of what their financial future looks like. So keep in mind that that's on its way.
Thank you, Paul. Excellent. Derek, you've got 1 minute 40 seconds.
Okay. In my crystal balls, I'm going straight for the crystal ball question. What I want to see are open to new entrants, collectively invested pension schemes. If the government wants pension schemes to invest productively in the economy, they need to be open schemes, because open schemes have the time horizon for that kind of investment. Everybody needs a pension. There's no generation that doesn't need a pension. Schemes must be open, not closed, otherwise we're excluding current and future generations. The pensions regulator seems to think that a successful scheme is a closed down, terminated and wound up one. I think a successful scheme is one which, despite everything, still takes new members, because you've found the benefit compromise and the contribution compromise that keeps it open. So that is my pitch. Open collective schemes, don't really care if they're DB or flexible DB or CDC, just as long as they're open, because then we're providing pensions for people.
Thank you, Derek. Jack, you're down to a minute, mate. Sorry.
That's fine. Everything I wrote down when you asked those questions has been answered by one of the three people who've gone before me, but I'll go through quickly what I had anyway. I mean, one is that on employers that it's back to kind of having as good a default as you possibly can. So with a contribution rate that gives people enough to live on in retirement, that is sensitive to affordability. I was going to make that point that Shelley made about kind of people that can't afford their contributions. It's really important that we think more about what happens to them. And as near as possible as you can get to kind of a default retirement pathway. Again, there are lots of things you can do short of having DB or CDC, but just something in place so that for most people they end up doing something, going into something appropriate without having to engage too much with their pensions is really important. For employee obligations, yeah, I talk about pensions to employees, sorry, to employers, to new employers. That's kind of, no one ever really asks about pension when they're going for a new job. And also, again, to pension wise and those kind of services that are available to give you guidance there. And then in terms of what I would like to see, again, it's kind of what Derek said, it's like reversing that trend where risk is being borne by individuals now, where we used to have collective solutions to retirement. Now it's more and more individualized, and that is, yes, that is kind of collective DC or open DB and that kind of thing, but also higher state pension, just things that where we kind of accept kind of collective responsibility for funding people's old age and have vehicles that do that rather than pushing more and more risk and responsibility for doing that onto individuals.
Okay, Jack, thank you. Anya, handing back to you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for that. So I'd just like to thank everybody that's attended the seminar today. I think it's been an absolutely brilliant seminar today. As I said at the beginning, it's a subject that we will probably want to return to. So any suggestions or comments on that would be greatly received. And lastly, just a huge thank you to Paul, Shelley, Jack and Derek for coming along and speaking today. The presentations we will share amongst those that have attended today, and we'll obviously share the recording of this session on the Alliance for Finance website in the next couple of days. So thank you very much to everybody, and see you hopefully on the next one.
Thanks, Anya. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, bye.
Thanks, bye.